Got a question for you. How long did it take you to get ready for church this morning? Now, some of you, I know, probably didn't take long. You probably got out of bed at 9 o'clock, hopped in the shower, threw some clothes on, went through the drive-thru at McDonald's, grabbed an Egg McMuffin and a cup of coffee, rushed down here, probably broke the speed limit to get here, and then you kind of tried to quietly squeeze into your seat about maybe 9:35 or so, right? Any of you? I won't ask for a show of hands. I don't want to embarrass anyone. Now, some of the rest of you, it took you a lot longer than that. You got up early. Maybe you made a nice breakfast and you sat around and you read the Sunday paper for a while, and you got in the shower and you got dressed and you had plenty of time. You kind of leisurely got in the car. You drove the speed limit to get here. Probably none of you did that, right? But you drove the speed limit to get here. Got here maybe about 9:10, 9:15. You went and grabbed a cup of coffee, sat in the lounge with some other people, kind of talked before the service, and then you still came in and you got in your seat by 9:35. And frankly, whether it took you 30 minutes to get ready or 2 hours and 30 minutes, really doesn't affect your ability to worship here this morning. Because those are all external things. But let me ask you another question that does impact your ability to worship this morning. How long did you take to prepare your soul and your spirit to come worship this morning? How much time did you spend this week reading the passage that I'm going to preach on this week? How much time did you spend looking at the message from last week and thinking about how you could take and apply it to your lives? How much time did you pray or did you spend praying for me and for our worship team and for our hospitality team and for our teachers that are teaching the children right now? The answer to that question does have an impact on your ability to worship this morning, doesn't it? Because it affects those things that are internal. And as we've been going through this sermon series called Modern Day Pharisees now, this will be the 6th and final week, we've been looking at how Jesus addressed the Pharisees. And one of the problems with the Pharisees, and we're going to see that really clearly this morning, is they focused on all the external things, but they didn't take a whole lot of time to develop the things that were internal. Now, every week up until now, we've began the message by kind of going through these 6 traits that we've identified that identify the fact that you might be a modern-day Pharisee. And I'm going to kind of wait and do that at the end this week because I want to use that as a review for everything that we've talked about for these last 6 weeks. So we're just going to jump right in this morning. And we're going to deal with this 6th trait that might indicate that you're a modern-day Pharisee. And here it is. You might be a modern-day Pharisee if you're more concerned, if you work harder at looking good than being good. You might be a modern-day Pharisee if you work harder at looking good than being good. If you haven't already done it, go ahead and take your Bibles out. Open them up to Matthew chapter 23 this morning. If you don't have a Bible with you or your phone or something you'd like to look on, there are Bibles in the chair fronts in front of you, so you can grab one of those as well. So Matthew chapter 23, we're going to finish up this morning. We're going to look at verses 25 through 28. And we're going to see what we can learn from this passage this morning. So Matthew chapter 23, verse 25. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites. We've heard that before, right? For you clean the outside of the cup and the plate, but inside they are full of greed and self-indulgence. You blind Pharisee, first clean the inside of the cup and the plate, that the outside also may be clean. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you are like whitewashed tombs, which outwardly appear beautiful, but within are full of dead people's bones and all uncleanness. So you also outwardly appear righteous to others, but within you are full of hypocrisy and lawlessness. Before we kind of make application to that passage, I want to take a moment to just give you a little bit of background about what Jesus is saying here to the scribes and to the Pharisees, because there's some things going on here that we might not be completely familiar with. We know in the Old Testament law that there were all these sometimes very complicated laws about how the people were to be clean before God. and they were all these complicated things. And the reason for that is that God wanted them to be clean when they came before Him to worship. And so there were all these really complicated rules about how a person could be clean. And we know that if a person did become unclean and they touched a vessel, if they touched a plate or a cup or something like that, that the plate and the cup then became unclean, and they had to be cleaned as well. So that if someone else touched them, they wouldn't become unclean. So there were all these laws about how to do that. And the Pharisees, the problem is they missed out on why God had those laws. I mean, the purpose of the law wasn't because God needed them to do all these complicated things. Part of the purpose of those laws was to demonstrate just how holy God was and how impossible it was for man to be right with God, and how hard it is for us to deal with our sin. And all those things were intended from the very beginning to point people towards Jesus Christ. But the scribes and the Pharisees had missed that. The second illustration he uses here is this idea of whitewashed tombs. And here's what would happen. During the Passover season, all the males in Israel, they had to go to Jerusalem to celebrate the Passover feast. There were actually 3 feasts, 3 different times a year when all the Jewish males would go to Jerusalem to worship at the temple. Well, the problem is on the road that they would take to come to Jerusalem, there were all these tombs along the road. And a lot of times you couldn't even tell they were there. And so what would happen is that about a month before Passover, some of the Jewish leaders, they would come along and they would whitewash these tombs so that you could see them. They would show up, and so no one would accidentally bump into one of those tombs and thus become unclean and not be able to participate in the Passover feast. And Jesus says to the Pharisees, He says to them, you guys are just like these whitewashed tombs. You look really good on the outside, but inside you're full of decaying, rotting corpses. And that was really true of the Pharisees here. And so this morning we're going to go ahead and do what we've done really throughout this series. We're going to look through and we're going to see what we can learn here about some traits that might indicate that we are a modern-day Pharisee. And then we're going to look at the remedy for those things. So we'll kind of follow the same pattern that we've done. So let's look first at how can I know that I'm a modern-day Pharisee? How can I really tell? And we're going to look again at 3 things this morning that might tell us that we're a modern-day Pharisee. Here's the first one. I value rules and religion over relationships. I value rules and religion over relationships. That's really true, wasn't it, of the Pharisees? They were so caught up in all these rules that they'd made, and they wanted to get everyone else to follow all the rules they'd made and all these religious things that they were doing on the outside. Rules that they didn't even follow themselves a lot of the times, but that was all their concern. And because of that, they lost out on the fact that what God really wanted was to have a relationship with them. And so this following the rules, it impacted their relationship with God, and it impacted their relationship with other people, because they were always judging other people based on all these rules that they'd made. And what we find is that they meticulously would follow all these rules and regulations about cleaning the outside of the dishes. But on the inside of those dishes was food that they had obtained by extortion, by cheating other people. Or maybe that was eaten in gluttony. And again, they missed out on the heart of the law and what God wanted. They missed out on the relationship, and they were so caught up in following all these rules and regulations that they missed out on the relationship. And the fact is, we can do the same thing too, can't we? We can really miss out on the relationship too. We can get so caught up in doing religious things and following certain rules that we miss out on the relationship that God wants to have with us. If you believe that being a Christian, that being a disciple of Jesus is all about coming to church or wearing the right clothes or praying the right prayers or even being baptized or praying the prayer of salvation or participating in the Lord's Supper, then you might be a modern-day Pharisee. Now, all those things are good, but they're never to be the things that allow us to have a relationship with a God who loves us and wants to have this intimate relationship with us. And so if you value rules and religion over relationship, then it's very possible that you might be a modern-day Pharisee. The second trait we see here is this. You might be a modern-day Pharisee if you're driven by your desires. If you're driven by your desires. When Jesus speaks to the Pharisees here, he says that they're full of two things. He uses two words here to describe them. He says that they're full of greed and that they're full of self-indulgence. And those words are great words. Those are accurate translations of the underlying Greek. But what we find, if you really dig into it, is those words in Greek, they almost can't be translated into just one English word in order to be able to really understand them. So the word that's translated greed here, you might notice if you're using a King James Bible, for instance, it's translated, I think, extortion. The NASB translates it robbery. And the word that's used there, it means to obtain something by pillaging or plundering. It means that you go and you get things that don't really belong to you and that you'll use pretty much any means that you need to get them. And that's what the Jews did. They were so wrapped up in having the things that they wanted, the power, the prestige, the high standing, social standing, all those things, that they were willing to go about getting those things by just about any means. The other word he uses there is the word self-indulgence, and it's a word that really just means a lack of self-control. I think the King James actually translates it excess. And the idea there is that we don't have any kind of control over our desires, that our desires control us. And that's certainly what was going on here with these Jewish leaders. They had no self-control. And because they were driven by their desires, they didn't really care how they got all this stuff. They didn't really care who they had to step over to get what they wanted. And the same thing can be true for us in our lives today. There's a lot of ways that we can be just controlled and driven by our desires. You know, you could do that in your marriage. It's possible, if you're married, to manipulate your spouse to get him or her to do whatever you want them to do, right? In order to satisfy your own desires. It's possible in your jobs to manipulate things to make sure that you get the raise that you want or the promotion. You can take credit for someone else's work. You can fudge a little bit on your resume sometimes, right? Or do those things that would allow you to get something that you wanted. We can do that with our material possessions, can't we? We can try to manipulate someone else into getting something for us. You know, grandkids are really good at that with their grandparents, right? They learn how to do that pretty well. And that's okay probably sometimes. But we can do that as adults too, can't we? Or we can be so driven by our desires that we buy things that we don't really need with money that we don't have. So there's a lot of ways that even we in our culture can be driven by these desires. You know that can even happen in the church? I haven't seen it here at Thornydale, but I've been in churches where I saw men campaign for leadership positions within the church. And they did that because in some cases they just wanted the prestige of it. They wanted to be seen by other people. I've also seen in some churches where they thought that would be pretty good for their business because maybe they were in business for themselves. And so we can do that too, can't we? We can miss out on this relationship that God wants us to have because we're driven by our desires. The third characteristic that might indicate that I'm a modern-day Pharisee is this, that I engage in a lifestyle of secret sin. Engage in a lifestyle of secret sin. Notice what Jesus says to him here. He says, you're full of hypocrisy and lawlessness. Now, we've talked about hypocrisy before, right? It's this idea of putting on a mask, of not being the same on the outside as you are on the inside, and that we do that to deceive other people. But he also says here that they're full of lawlessness, and the word there literally means without the law. But in the context here, what Jesus is really saying to them is, you guys have a contempt for the law. Man, that must have hurt the Pharisees, because these guys thought they were the greatest law keepers of all times. And yet Jesus said, no, you don't really have a love for the law, because all you're doing is you're reaching out, as we talked about last week. All you care about is the letter of the law, and you don't really care about the heart of the law or the spirit of the law. And so on the outside they look great, but inside he says that your attitudes are all messed up. And we can see this clearly. Jesus gives us an example. He told a parable about a Pharisee and a tax collector. And in that parable, we see that the Pharisee prayed like this. If you can go to the next slide there, Abigail. The Pharisee, standing by himself, prayed thus: God, I thank you that I'm not like other men, extortioners, unjust, adulterers, or even like this tax collector. I fast twice a week. I give tithes of all that I get. Isn't that a perfect description of the attitude of the Pharisees? They had all these problems inside, and yet on the outside they thought they were great, that all they had to do was to take care of the outside. They never worked on taking care of the inside. And it's possible for us to do that too, isn't it? It's possible for us to look all great. It's possible for us to fight like cats and dogs in the car on the way to church on Sunday morning. And then just as soon as we walk through the door, we're all smiles, right? It's possible to, in your families and in your marriages, to have them all falling apart, and yet on the outside there's this facade that can make them look like everything is just fine. It's easy to get caught up in habits that can become addictions, and yet put on a really pretty good front sometimes, in which we don't ever really let other people see that. And we look good on the outside, but secretly we're living this life of sin on the inside. And if that describes your life, then it's very possible. As a matter of fact, I'd say it's almost for sure that you're a modern-day Pharisee. So I might be a modern-day Pharisee if I work harder at looking good than being good. So what do I do about that? What's the remedy if I've gotten caught up in that? I'm going to share just two things with you this morning that I think make up the remedy. Here's the first one. Here's the first thing that we need to do, is to be authentic and transparent. To be authentic and transparent. Boy, the Pharisees were far from that, weren't they? Now I know there are some people who are here this morning who are dealing with some struggles in your life, maybe with an addiction, maybe with some sin that's really tough. You know how I know that? Because you've been really open about that. You've been willing to share that and to be transparent and to ask other people to pray for you and to say, yeah, I'm struggling with this. And if that describes you, I want to commend you this morning. Because that's the important first step that you have to take if you want to be able to deal with this tendency to be a Pharisee, is to be open and authentic and transparent. But I also know that in a group of this size, there are probably some people, matter of fact, I'm almost sure there are some people out here this morning who are also dealing with addictions, who are dealing with some kind of lifestyle of sin, and you've done a really good job of covering it up. And you haven't told anyone else about it. You might even be able to hide it from your spouse or your family or your kids. And you certainly haven't told me, you haven't told anyone else in the church about it. But guess what? That lifestyle, it's going to end up eating you up if you're not willing to be authentic and transparent. Guess which one of those two groups the people are going to be able to deal with that sin or that addiction? It's the group that's willing to be authentic and transparent. Not the group that's going to try to cover everything up like the Pharisees did and just pretend that everything's okay. So the first thing I have to do is be authentic and transparent. The second thing, and this is really the key, I think the key to this whole series we've been looking at, is I have to let Jesus clean up my life from the inside out. I can't do it on my own. I have to let Jesus do that. And that was the problem with the Pharisees, is they never recognized that they had a heart problem. And therefore, they never allowed Jesus to come into their life to clean it up. Now let me illustrate this. Let's suppose that the check engine light is on in my vehicle, which it happens to be right now. It's been that way for a while. I can do one of three things when that check engine light comes on. I could put a piece of tape over it and just ignore that it ever happened, right? I could do that. The second thing I could do is that I could try to fix it myself. Now, there was a time when I used to be able to work on my own cars, when they were a lot simpler than they are today. But frankly, most of the stuff today I can't fix because I don't have the knowledge, I don't have the tools that I need to do that. And so I'm not going to be very successful if I try to do that. The third thing I can do is I can take it to my mechanic, because he has the tools, he has the training, he has the knowledge, and he's the one that's likely to be able to actually fix that problem. Well, the Pharisees were kind of in the same boat. Jesus says to them, he says, inside, you're dead. You're like these whitewashed tombs that just has death inside of it. And you know what? That describes every one of us here in this room at one time in our lives. Every single one of us in this room, we were dead. We were full of death at one time. Here's how the Apostle Paul describes it in Ephesians chapter 2. He says, and you were dead in your trespasses and sins in which you once walked, following the course of this world, following the prince of the power of the air, the spirit that is now at work in the sons of disobedience, among whom we all once lived in the passions of our flesh. Does that sound like something we talked about earlier, being driven by our desires? Carrying out the desires of the body and the mind, and here's the key, and we were by nature children of wrath like the rest of mankind. At one time, every single one of us was dead. And we have a choice. We can do one of three things about that, just like with my car. The first thing is I can just ignore it. I can just try to pretend that I'm not really dead. But that doesn't work, does it? The second thing I can do is that is I can try to fix it myself. But that doesn't work either. A dead person cannot revive himself. If you're dead, I want to see you bring yourself back to life. Physically, you can't do it, and you can't do it spiritually either. So the third thing I can do, and the only one that works, is I have to let Jesus clean me up from the inside out. And fortunately, He's done everything that He needed to do to make that possible in our lives. The very next verse in Ephesians chapter 2 says this, but God, being rich in mercy because of the great love with which He loved us, even when we were dead in our trespasses, made us alive together with Christ. By grace you have been saved. Notice what it says there. It says God is the one who made us alive. We couldn't do it on our own. You can't clean up your life on your own. If you're a modern day Pharisee, you can't overcome that on your own. The only way that can happen is that you bring Jesus into your life and you allow Him to clean it up from the inside out. Do you know that even the faith that you have to believe in Jesus Christ, that's not something that you generated on your own? Even the faith that you have, it's a gift of God. Notice what Paul continues there in Ephesians 2. For by grace you have been saved through faith, and this, he's talking about the whole process, including your faith, is not your own doing. It is the gift of God, not as a result of works, that no one may boast. You cannot clean up yourself. Only God can do that. Only God can even give you the faith that you need to clean up your life. So you have to let Jesus come along and clean it up from the inside out. You can't do it yourself. Now, over the past 6 weeks, we've looked at 6 different characteristics that might show that you're a modern-day Pharisee. And then at the end of the service today, we're going to kind of change up how we give you an opportunity to respond to God. And I'll explain a little bit more about that to you in a moment. But here's what I want you to start thinking about right now. As I go through these 6 traits, I want you to prayerfully consider whether one or more of them is something that you've gotten caught up in. that you'd have to honestly say to God, God, yeah, I've become a modern-day Pharisee. And I need to take care of that. And that you can begin to pray about that and ask God to help you do it. So let me just we're going to go through this rather slowly so you can take a moment to just reflect upon each one. But let's go back. Let's look at where we've come over these last 6 weeks. So here's the first indication that you might be a modern-day Pharisee. You might be a modern-day Pharisee if you judge the Scriptures rather than being judged by them. You try to twist the Scriptures around to excuse the sin in your life. If you're always judging other people rather than judging your own life. As a matter of fact, as I shared with you, I think it was last week, you might be a modern-day Pharisee if you're calling someone else a Pharisee. The purpose of this series is not for you to look around at everyone else and figure out who else might be a Pharisee. It's for each of us, and that includes me, to look at our own lives and see how we might have done that. Here's the second indication that you might be a modern-day Pharisee. You think you're better than other Christians. You look around and instead of comparing yourselves to the standard of God, you start comparing yourself to other Christians, and you think, man, I'm pretty good compared to old so-and-so. Then you might be a modern-day Pharisee. Here's the third indication that you might be a modern-day Pharisee. You're more interested in making clones of yourself than disciples of Jesus. You think that everyone else ought to be just like you, that they ought to do things just like you, because you have it all figured out, and boy, if they want to have a relationship with Jesus, they better do it just like you do. Rather than allowing Jesus to work in their life in the way that He desires. Here's the fourth indication you might be a modern-day Pharisee. You look for loopholes in God's Word in order to excuse your sin. Boy, the Pharisees were great at that. Oh, if I swear on the temple, well, I don't have to do it, but if I swear on the gold in the temple, well, now I have to do what I say. And we talked about the importance of simply just letting your yes be yes and your no be no. The next indication you might be a modern-day Pharisee is this. You major in minor and minor in majors. Boy, the Pharisees were good about that, right? Tithing those, counting out those little seeds, one for God, 9 for me, 1 for God, 9 for me. And yet on the inside, they were just, as we saw this morning, they were like these whitewashed tombs. And then finally, the one we looked at this morning, you might be a modern-day Pharisee if you're more worried about looking good than being good. So we've covered all of these over the last 6 weeks. And this morning, as we close our time, we want to give you an opportunity to respond to the message today. And we're going to do this in a little different way than we've done it in the past. And so, before I get there, I almost forgot one more thing. Earlier this morning, we sang the song From the Inside Out. And that really, as I said at the time, was intended to be a prayer. And I would call it really kind of the anti-Pharisee song, because I don't think any of the Pharisees could have actually sung the words, at least not meant them. And that song begins with these words that I think really help us to understand what God is and what it means to give our heart. So here's how the song opens. 1,000 times I've failed, still your mercy remains. And should I stumble again, I'm caught in your grace. And the idea here is that we go before God and we say, God, I've stumbled. I've fallen. I know that I need you to come into my life and to clean me up from the inside out. And then as we get to the chorus, we said the chorus is really this prayer. And this is my favorite part of the song. This has always been one of my favorite songs, but it says, in my heart and my soul, Lord, I give you control. Consume me from the inside out. Lord, let justice and praise become my embrace to love you from the inside out. I want to encourage you to take those words to heart this morning.